You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 154. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. What comes to mind for you when you hear the words self-care? Maybe you imagine yourself at a spa, you've got a mud mask on your face, a white towel wrapped around your head, you're lying in a nice warm tub, you've got a glass of cold cucumber water in your hand, and you're listening to that gentle spa music. Maybe that's what comes to mind for you. Maybe you think of yourself on a silent retreat, a 3-day getaway where you just get to meditate and eat healthy organic food that somebody else prepares for you and think about your life and sleep and relax. Maybe when you think about self-care, you think about green juices and that all raw food diet or whatever it happens to be. And if those are the ideas that come to mind when you hear the word self-care, and then you ask yourself how often you engage in those practices, my guess is that you're not spending your day-to-day at the spa or on a silent retreat, or that every meal that you are consuming is made of raw vegetables. And the reason that I want us to focus on self-care today is because it's something that comes up so often, right? It comes up so often with lawyers that I work with, and yet it's something that feels elusive, right? So what I am going to help you with today is to think about self-care in a way that is tangible, in a way that simplifies self-care, in a way that makes self-care something that you can integrate into your day-to-day practice, as opposed to self-care being this thing that you need to almost reserve time for, something that you would need to reserve a weekend for or push it off to some special occasion. I want to help you integrate self-care into your day-to-day and give yourself the permission that you may need in order to make this practice something that you engage in regularly. So the way I see it, the reason that this is a bit of a problem is that we get so busy that we sometimes put self-care to the bottom of the list. So what you might find is if you're a brand new lawyer, or you might think back to when you were a brand new lawyer, that's a period of transition where a lot of lawyers will experience self-care challenges. They won't have the time that they think they need in order to properly look after themselves. And so you may find, or you may have found, that the transition from a structured environment like law school, where there was a certain amount of predictability and you had a certain amount of control over your schedule, that you were able to find practices and routines that helped you take care of yourself. But when you began practicing, you may have felt a lot of pressure to always be available. You may have found that you had unpredictable deadlines. You may have found that you were spending more time at the office. There were more office snacks that you had access to. And next thing you know, you just weren't feeling yourself. Challenges with establishing self-care can happen many years into practice. You may find that you have ebbs and flows in your practice, and sometimes those flows can last for quite some time. And what you might find is maybe systems and structures that you put in place to help you take care of yourself fall to the wayside. And over time, you start to feel a bit run down. You start to feel a bit burnt out. So that can be one of those cases where your self-care has no longer been a priority for you. And so you're looking to reestablish some routines. It can also happen when you're experiencing life transitions. So if you're a parent, for example, you may have noticed with the arrival of your first child that things shifted a little bit, right? When you had responsibility for caring for your child, that meant less time to look after yourself. I know when I had my first child, it was a huge shift, right? Things that previously had been self-care activities for me, like going out for dinner with friends, going to the movies, traveling to places where I could sit on a beach and put my feet up, a lot of the activities that meant self-care for me were no longer manageable. They were no longer doable, or if they were, it was on a much different type of schedule. And so if you're going through a transition like that, you've had your first child, your second child, your third child, and you're noticing that it's having an impact on your ability to care for yourself, then what we want to do, and the purpose of today's call, is to help you find some systems and routines and some self-care practices that are going to help you to feel better, to carve out that time and do it in a way that feels sustainable. So what are the roadblocks that I see that prevent people from creating and adhering to their self-care plans? Well, number one is I think that there's a tendency to make self-care a little bit more complicated than it needs to be. So going back to the idea of a spa or a retreat or eating an all organic diet or whatever it happens to be, if we set our sights on this notion of self-care that feels out of reach, that feels unattainable and feels complicated, we're so much less likely to engage with it and to practice it and to do it. So what you may find is that you think of self-care as this thing where you need to do things that are quite complex, that are not something that would fit very well into your current routine. And so you end up not doing it at all. Another reason why you may find that your self-care routines aren't something that you're able to stick to consistently is that they're simply not sustainable, right? And so many of us feel like we just don't have time, right? You've got your busy practice, you've got your life outside of your practice, maybe you've got family who relies on you, friends who rely on you, you have joined a number of different committees or you're volunteering on boards, you have things to do. And what you might find is that you have developed a habit of putting everybody else first and putting yourself last. It may also be that you had a routine, it was working for you, and then things started to happen, right? Your practice got really busy, maybe one of your kids got sick, and you just never really got yourself back on track. And you know that you feel better when you've got that routine, but you just don't seem to be able to re-engage with it. And another reason why I think so many of us shy away from self-care is that we think it's selfish. We think that it's wrong for us to put ourselves first. We might feel guilty about spending time on ourselves, spending money on ourselves. We might feel guilty about the time that we take on ourselves, what that takes from others, whether it's our clients, whether it's our family, whether it's our children, whether it's our friends. And then finally, we might look at the impact that it has on other people, right? If you start taking better care of yourself, and that means letting other people help out with certain tasks, you might feel a little bit guilty of the impact that your self-care is having on others. So what that can lead to is that you may ignore the idea of self-care altogether, right? You might be going through your life, you're really busy. The idea of self-care is just something that you don't even engage with right now. It would be overwhelming. And so you let it drift. You ask yourself, who even has time to think about self-care? Certainly not you. Although, if you're listening to this podcast, bravo, I'm thrilled you're here, because this is a time for us to start thinking about self-care and how to make it more doable for you. Another way that you might be dealing with self-care or the lack of self-care is you might think about it, but then you talk yourself out of it, right? So you might know that going to that morning yoga session is really good for you, that it makes you feel really energized. It sets you up for a really productive day. And yet you might think, well, today I've got a deadline. I need to get to the office really early so that I can meet that deadline. And so you push it off, even though you know that the benefit that you would receive from doing that class would actually pay off in dividends, and you would very likely still make that deadline. Another reason why we don't necessarily engage in self-care practices is that we may simply put it off, right? You might know that you want to start moving more regularly. Maybe you like to walk or run, or maybe you like certain gym classes, and yet you push that off, right? You push that off into the future thinking, I'll do it when, right? I'll do it when my kids are older. I'll do it when the trial is over. I'll do it when these closings are finally wrapped up. I'll do it after I help my friend move out of her apartment, etc., right? So we can find ourselves in a trap where we continually push off self-care to some point in the future. And of course, the problem there is that we don't end up practicing self-care. We don't end up developing systems that work for us. We just keep ignoring it or choosing not to do it or pushing it off into some point in the future. And what that can create in the long run is that you start to feel really tired, right? When you're not looking after yourself. And if you're in that spot right now, you can probably feel it, right? You feel a little bit burned down. If you were a cell phone or I guess a smartphone and you had that battery bar up in the top right-hand corner and you looked at it, you notice, right? Your batteries are starting to get depleted. And if that goes on over time, you end up in that yucky red zone where, you're really starting to get close to burnout, right? You might find that the quality of your work suffers. So if you're really burnt out, you're not taking care of yourself, you're not getting enough sleep, your brain capacity may feel like it's just not firing on all cylinders. You might find that your work quality is not at the standard that you want. You might find that your interpersonal relations with people at work might be a little bit less of the nature that you would like. You might have less patience. You might not be able to articulate yourself as well. Physically, you might feel less confident. I know I feel that way when I start to neglect my self-care and I just don't feel good. I don't feel like I present as well. And so I find I might shy away from opportunities to speak with people, particularly in person. Maybe you can relate to that as well. You might also find that your health really starts to suffer. You might start having aches and pains. You might start feeling really achy in your shoulders, for example. You might find that you're more lethargic. You don't have the energy to do things that you would like to do. You might get sick, right? For many of us, you might find that you have a really intense period at work. You are basically running on coffee and adrenaline. And then when you're done, you just get sick. You catch a flu, you catch a cold, and you might find yourself out for a few days. You might also find that when you're neglecting your self-care, that you start to feel really, really resentful. So you might be resentful about the demands of your clients, right? They might be asking for things and you're feeling like this is way beyond what they should be asking for. I know this happens to me sometimes where I'm so maxed out, right? That's the language I might use with myself. I'm so maxed out that I feel resentful when people ask me to do things. And even though these are things that on a normal day, I wouldn't really hesitate over, I wouldn't really think twice about them, when they are a request made when I'm already feeling pretty burnt out, then I start to become resentful. You might notice this in others. If you've got people in your lives who are perhaps those doers, right? Those people who take everything on and they're always wanting to sign up for the bake sale and volunteer on the committee and do all the things at work. They take on all the projects, etc. And you might notice that sometimes they feel very resentful, right? You catch them complaining about a client or you catch them complaining about how busy they are. And you might notice how there's that correlation, so much easier to see in other people. You might notice that in yourself as well, right? That you start to feel a little bit chippy when it comes to your children or your partner or your friends or your colleagues. And that can be a sign that you're feeling a little bit burnt out. You might feel overwhelmed and reactive. So I notice this in clients sometimes, and it's really interesting to observe when lawyers come to me and they feel so reactive and rushed and panicked and they don't know what to do next. And it's almost like I can just sense that the amount of time that they're spending on self-care is probably nil to zero. And that can be such a game changer, right? To simply step back and invest that time in yourself. That can have a huge impact on your ability to take the problems or challenges that you're facing and deal with them so much more effectively, so much more proactively instead of being in that reactive zone. So that can be another sign. Other signs, you might feel unfulfilled, right? You might find that things that normally brought you joy, whether it's at work or outside of work, you just don't have the energy to do them. You just don't really feel as engaged. You might lack motivation, especially at work. This is going to be really problematic. You know, when you're tired and you show up at work and you've got a really complicated matter that you're working on, whether it's drafting an argument or you're drafting a contract, and you know you need your full brain horsepower to do it. And if you're feeling run down or burnt out, you can feel so unmotivated to get started because you just know it's going to be hard and you don't have the bandwidth to do it. And then finally, you might feel like the pace that you're at is unsustainable and you have that desire to escape it, right? That's when lawyers often talk about their plan B. Well, if I wasn't a lawyer, I would open up a flower shop. If I wasn't a lawyer, I would go and be a barista. If I wasn't a lawyer, I would go and become a hostess or whatever it is. So there's all these plan Bs that you might fantasize about. And little caveat here, I do wonder for many of us, if we were to go and open up a coffee shop or, do something totally different in alignment with that plan B, if we're bringing ourselves to that equation, chances are we might find ourselves in that overwhelm again, right? We might not take that change and the opportunity in order to add in the self-care. So these are all things that can happen when we don't have the self-care. And one thing I'd love to note here, because I want to make sure I say it at least once during this podcast episode, is that sometimes when we don't have a self-care practice, then we start to get upset with ourselves because we don't have a self-care practice. And so we start thinking, I should have a self-care practice. I know I should be taking better care of myself. I know I should get more sleep. I know I should go to the gym. I know I should eat better. I know I should. And then you end up feeling even worse thinking about self-care than if you just ignored it altogether. So please, 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 please do not take this episode as me telling you that you should have a self-care practice. And if you don't, that you're doing something wrong. Absolutely not. If you take anything away from this podcast episode, it is that the self-care practice is something that I would invite you to consider doing from where you are right now, right? Build on where you are, what you can do that is simple. And I'll get into more details about this very soon, but please don't use this as another reason to layer more duties or practices onto yourself, especially if that's just going to be too much for you. So with that, what I'd love to share with you now are some suggestions to help you make self-care something that is doable for you. And I'd like to approach this from 3 different perspectives. The first is to look at self-care and break it down into categories. I'm going to break it down into 3 categories. I'm going to talk about physical self-care, mental self-care, and what I'm referring to as the bonus self-care. So the reason I'm going to do it that way is because I want to give you ideas so that when you're thinking about your own self-care, whether you have an existing practice and you're wanting to refine it, or you're starting from zero, not necessarily that you don't have any practices, but you don't have any conscious practices. You may have been doing things that are in line with self-care, but maybe now you want to be more intentional about it. So wherever you are on the spectrum, I want to offer you some ways to think about self-care so that you can decide what is most valuable to you, what types of self-care are going to have the most impact for you in your life and in your practice. So that's the first thing we're going to do. Then I am going to share some ideas, some strategies so that you can make your practices sustainable. And then finally, we're going to spend a tiny bit of time just talking about getting back on track, because what I have noticed is that in so many things in life, with all practices in life, there will be times where you're diligently practicing and you're getting better at what you're doing and you feel the progress and you feel so good and everything's right on track. And then you get disrupted and the practice falls apart and you end up feeling like, how am I ever going to get back on track? How are you ever going to get back to that level that you were at? So let's prepare for that. Let's anticipate that that's very likely going to happen. It's not a problem. We just want some ideas about how we can get back on track. So with that, we're going to dive in to that first part of self-care, which is looking at the types of self-care. So as I go through these 3 types, I would invite you to imagine you in your life and how you approach each of these 3 categories. So the first one is physical self-care. So that's really caring for your physical body. And I think there's really 3 categories here. At least when I think about it, those are the categories. You might have other ones. So I think about exercise and movement, proper nutrition, and rest. Those are the 3 things that I need in my self-care routine and that I see others typically engaging in theirs. So first, let's talk about exercise or movement. This is where I think a lot of us can get really thrown off by trying to have a movement or exercise plan that is a fantasy plan, that is a plan that would work for someone who is not you, right? when I think of exercise, I used to try to join gyms. I remember in university, I used to routinely sign up for the gym, and I used to routinely draw up a calendar, and I would routinely have myself booked into certain classes, at least in my fantasy version of me. And I almost never adhered to those plans ever. And I would feel so badly about it, and I would waste all this money on gyms, and I would feel guilty, and I'd bring my gym clothes to the university. I was commuting from home. I would just never do it. And what it took me a long time to learn is that I don't like gyms at all. I don't like to go in them. I don't like how I feel in them. I don't like machines. I love to be outside. I love to be on my own time. I love to do things where I can just show up and do them. And so it wasn't so much that I'm lazy or incapable or never going to have a path to fitness. It's that I was trying to do the wrong thing. So what I do now is I do exercises that are very simple. I run, and I have a routine that I do in my backyard. That is my commitment to my physical health. I've got a friend who goes to the gym, and she is strong and she looks great. She's got all these wonderful muscles, and I look at her and I think she's amazing, and that is so not for me. So I would invite you to think about what you actually like in terms of physical movement. What is going to give you the goals that you have for yourself? And think about what those goals are, right? What do you want out of physical movement, right? I think it's great to have some exercise that is somewhat intense. There's a lot of research that supports the idea that physical exercise, especially outside, helps with depression and anxiety. It helps with your overall health, your strength, your cardiovascular health, mood. I mentioned that. I find it helps me settle my brain. I find I have a lot of busy thoughts going on. And so when I start my day with relatively vigorous physical exercise, I feel energized and focused for the rest of the day. I like mornings. That works for me. It always has. Since having children, I've actually pushed my morning up to quite an early spot just because that's what works with our family. And that has actually worked really well for me. So for you, I'd invite you to think about when in the day exercise is going to work for you. So what types of activities are going to be energizing and reasonably enjoyable for you, what fits with your personality. Maybe you like gym classes, right? I was speaking with a lawyer recently who said she likes being at classes where there's an instructor that is leading her, telling her what to do. If that's what you like, then that's what you should sign up for. I know for myself, if I try to schedule a class at the end of a workday, I'm less likely to attend it. If I feel tired, I'm not going to want to go to it. And so I just solved that problem for myself by doing it in the morning. If you're not a morning person though, that probably wouldn't work for you. So figure out what you like, figure out when in the day it's actually going to work for you, and make it doable. Now, if the idea of something that is vigorous, like going to a gym and doing, I don't know, a CrossFit workout, if that just seems like too much, then please don't set yourself up for failure by making that the one and only thing that you can ever do. I strongly believe that we are better off doing little bits of things that are doable than trying to do a lot of something that we're never going to do. And if you imagine yourself at the beginning of a journey, right? Let's say what you really want is to be in CrossFit and you want that really hardcore exercise, but right now you've been on break for a few months and you're not at that level of strength and stamina, then you can start slowly, right? Maybe you start with a walk, just building that habit into your day-to-day so that you start to see yourself as somebody who's engaged in regular physical activity. And you can build from there. So, as I mentioned, I like to run. I also think it's great to build movement into your day-to-day. So if you're like me, you're sedentary most of the day. I sit at a computer. Right now I am sitting recording this episode for you. So what are you doing all day? And do you need to find ways to integrate more activity into your day? I noticed when I stopped working at an office and started working from home, there was actually a noticeable decrease in my activity level. I can't really explain how I felt more active when I was working in an office. I think it must have been walking around the office, walking to and from bus stops. I was transiting to work, walking to and from lunch, maybe going out for coffee with friends in the middle of the day. But I did notice that when I started working at home, I felt like I was much more sedentary. So you might need to find ways to integrate movement into your day, whether it's a walk around the block after lunch, whether it's a longer walk than that, whatever it is, just to keep yourself moving and feeling good. So that is the first category in that physical self-care, which is moving. It makes such a difference. The second category is nutrition, right? And I think you've probably all heard that expression that food is medicine. And what we put into our bodies does have a huge impact on how we feel, our energy levels, and our overall health. And I could do probably several podcast episodes about the deep dives I've done into health and nutrition and what types of foods are health foods for me. Everyone's going to have a different response in terms of what is going to work for them. So what works for you may not work for your neighbor, may not work for me. What works for me may not work for you, etc. But what I have found is that when I'm consistent and intentional about the foods that I choose, overall, I feel so much better. So what does that mean? I plan meals. I've got a family to feed, and so I have no choice but to sit down on the weekend and do my grocery shopping and planning for the week. So I try to plan meals that are balanced and healthy. If I didn't have a family to feed, I would probably not be so meticulous about planning things out, but I'd have certain categories or standards or habits in terms of where I would go. I find I like to do things that are routine and repetitive, and I'll get to this in terms of how to make things stick. But with meals, I've got certain go-to meals that I know are easy and healthy for my family. I've got a lunch plan. I eat basically the same thing for lunch every day. I enjoy it. It reduces my decision fatigue. And there are certain foods that are energizing that I will try to consume more of. So I think of vegetables and proteins and healthy fats and a lot of water, a lot of green tea. Those are things that I will consume as much as possible. And then there are other foods that I need to either avoid or consume in moderation. So for me, that would be sugar. There's a lot of research out there that talks about the effect of sugar on your body, and it's pretty sobering. And so I try to limit the amount of sugar that I'm consuming. Alcohol, it used to be more a part of my life in my 20s and 30s when I had more of a social life that involved eating at restaurants and going to parties. And it just seemed to be a lot more a thing. Since having kids, I've just not really been all that interested. It doesn't really match my lifestyle. So I tend to limit or avoid alcohol, refined carbs, refined processed foods, things that don't sit well with me. I generally try to either minimize or avoid them because of the way that they make me feel. So for you, I'd invite you to think about what types of foods are energizing you, what feels sustainable, what feels good, and what doesn't feel good, and to be conscious and conscientious about how you consume. Another one is coffee. I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with coffee. I do love it, and so I continue to drink it, but I do find when I don't drink it, I'm a little bit calmer. I find I actually feel a bit better. My skin's a little bit clearer, and yet I still really enjoy it. So, I enjoy it, but I try not to drink too much of it. I can't drink coffee past noon or I don't sleep at night. So you might find for yourself, are you consuming the right level of caffeine for you? And then finally, so we've got exercise, we've got nutrition, and then rest. And rest, I think, is one of those areas that is very difficult, especially if you've got a busy social life, a busy work life, a busy family life. So getting enough sleep matters. It is a time for your body to rest and recover. And you do a lot of mental processing in your sleep. So you do not want to cut down on sleep if you can avoid it. It's really productive. If I have to sell it as productive, it is. And what you might do is just find ways to get more sleep. So for example, when my kids were younger, I at one point just decided that I was no longer going to stay up after they went to bed. I was going to sleep when they went to bed, because what I had been doing up until that point was putting them to bed and then staying up later watching TV or scrolling on my phone, and I would just feel tired. So I started to go to bed earlier, and then I started waking up earlier, and that gave me more sleep, and it also opened up an opportunity for me to do things in the morning. I'll talk a little bit more about my mornings, but you might find that that works for you too. An earlier bedtime might mean that you can wake up earlier or even just get more sleep. If you're a morning person like me, you might find that shifting your sleep patterns to allow for more early morning time will give you time that you can use for self-care. Yes, indeed. That is the theme, of course. So when you think about your own plan for physical self-care, I would invite you to think about those things, right? What physical activities do you enjoy? And when can you realistically fit them in without having to overhaul your entire schedule? What kind of foods do you enjoy? Are there foods that you want to add more of to your day-to-day? Are there foods that maybe you want to limit? How much rest are you getting? If you are getting enough rest, that's great. Keep it up. If you feel like you need a little bit more rest, then how do you want to fit that in? Does it mean that you want to go to bed earlier? Maybe you can take naps. Some of my clients will take a nap in the afternoon because that restores their productivity. Maybe you have a nap on the weekend. Maybe you don't have time for naps, but you can squeeze in a little bit more sleep in the evening. So again, it's just raising your awareness and thinking about how you can do these things. And again, going back to the theme of the podcast, the idea is to keep things simple and doable. So we look at your physical, then we're going to move on to your mental health self-care plan. And here, these really are strategies to help you feeling good. And when I think about mental health, I think about my cognitive health, like how am I thinking? I think about how I'm feeling, and I'm thinking about where I'm at in my life. Am I feeling good? Am I feeling down? And the goal here is to create sustainable practices that allow me to feel at my best and to operate at my best in work, in life, in all areas. So the things that help me, and they may help you too when it comes to supporting yourself in terms of your mental health. Number one for me is I love predictability and peace of mind. I find that when my life feels out of control, when it feels unpredictable, when I don't know what is happening next, I get anxious. I have a hard time focusing. I feel unwell. And so for me, mental health actually starts with having consistent routines and planning ahead. I have numerous podcast episodes about time management, and I'm just thinking out loud, maybe the reason I'm so obsessed, frankly, with time management is that it gives me a sense of control and a sense of peace and focus and certainty over how I'm going to spend my days. And so for you, you might find that your mental health is very much, it's more at peace. You feel better when you have a plan. And I notice this in clients who come to me, particularly with life transitions. I've got a number of clients right now who are at crossroads in their careers where they're looking at decisions that will impact them over the next several years. And one of the reasons that I think they have all shared with me is that they want that peace of mind. They want that comfort of knowing what they're doing for the next 5 years. So mental health to me starts with having a plan in place so that you have that predictability. You have that sense of calm. You know more or less what is coming next. Now, there's always going to be things that are outside of your control, but I invite you to start with a plan, one that works for you. So for you, I'd invite you to think about where you need a plan, right? Where in your life do you need to have a plan? It might be a work plan. So when it comes to planning your work days, I've got strategies and systems. I love consistent planning. When it comes to your family, if you've got young kids, then chances are you're in the thick of it where you know that every weekend needs a plan, because if you have unstructured time and 2-year-olds running around, you have a problem. Children thrive on routine. When I had my children, I realized, yep, they need routine. And hey, guess what? I also feel a lot better when I have routine. So think about where you've got routines. You might think about how you're planning, right? So I talked about planning meals ahead of time. I plan my work days ahead of time. I plan weekends ahead of time. So look at the areas where you can put plans into place. And then I like to have, in addition to plans, routines. So things that I do consistently. So I mentioned I exercise early in the morning, and that is part of my morning routine. So every morning is pretty much the same. Certainly on weekdays, it's exercise, it's a shower, I sit down and I journal for a few minutes, I then write out my plan for the day, then I open my computer, I look at emails, I do some work, then I make my kids lunches, then I have them downstairs, they sleep upstairs, I'm downstairs in the kitchen doing all these things. I bring them down for breakfast, take them to school, and then I start to work again. And I could go on my whole days. On weekdays, they are pretty much the same. Work, lunch, work, break, work, dinner, bedtime with the kids. They follow a certain routine, and that brings me comfort. On weekends, it's a little bit different. I do try to still wake up early. I still try to journal. I still exercise. There are certain things that are pretty much embedded. But the idea there is once you have those routines in place, you don't have to rethink them. And again, it gives you certain cues. So your body gets used to those physical cues. If I wake up and I don't exercise, it feels a lot weirder to me than if I just simply get up, put on my workout gear and my sneakers and get outside. So for you, I'd invite you to think about what kinds of routines would support you in terms of your overall well-being and mental health, right? The next item that I have on my list of how to care for your mental health, so the first is having those routines and plans in place, is to connect with yourself. This is really important, and it might seem weird to you if it's not something that you already do, but we have a lifelong relationship with ourselves. Our longest relationship is the one that we have with ourselves. And yet I think we often neglect ourselves to the detriment of ourselves and to the benefit of others. And what I'd love for you to do is to simply start to have more of a relationship with yourself, understand yourself better, understand how you think. And there's a few ways you can do this. Number one is self-talk. And I'm putting this one first because I think it's probably the most important and the one where I see the greatest room for leverage. When I speak with lawyers and they tell me a story about where they're at in life, I often hear these very subtle cues that the dialogue they have with themselves is negative. They're not where they should be. They are always behind. They should have figured this out by now. These sentences that they're speaking to themselves that are cutting themselves down. And it's so subtle. And if you think about it, these are not things you would ever say to somebody else. If your best friend or your child was struggling, you would never say, well, you should have figured it out by now. But we say that to ourselves. And so in order to build connection with ourselves, the very first thing I would recommend doing is to simply speak to yourself more kindly. And it may be a big shift, but if you do that one thing already, you're just going to feel so much better. So self-talk, we can certainly focus on being kind to ourselves. And this is something that I have adopted as a practice, and it's night and day. I feel so much better about myself. Sometimes I do really annoying things like phone my mom and tell her about my day and how I'm proud of myself because I did X, Y, and Z. And yes, maybe it's a little bit weird if you don't do that, but you know what? It really helps to feel good about yourself. And it, for me, certainly helps with my mental health. And so why not try it? Another way to connect with yourself is journaling. So I mentioned I journal every morning. It's a consistent practice that I have. Typically, I'll just write out my thoughts. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. It doesn't even have to make sense. But the idea is that you're starting to take what's in your head and put it down on paper where you can see it, where you can externalize it. You can let things go. If you're really upset about something, it might help you to write it out, to journal about it. If you're really happy about something, it might help to write about it. So you're really just using that time to connect with yourself, to connect with your thoughts. I find writing on a piece of paper to be really relaxing. I like that practice. Some people like to type it on a screen. Some people will write it on a screen and then delete it. So there's lots of different approaches to journaling. I like to have prompts. I have 5 prompts that I use every morning. I'll share them with you. One is, what am I grateful for? The next one is, what is a dream that I have? The third is, what is one idea that I can generate? The fourth is an I am statement. And then the fifth is an I will statement. So I've gone through those quickly, not going to spend time on them, but just wanted to share them with you and to invite you to think about what prompts for a journaling practice, if you choose to adopt one, would work for you. And again, going back to this idea of keeping your practice, your self-care practice simple, I'm giving you a lot of ideas today, and you do not need to incorporate all of these. That would probably be the opposite of simple. What I am hoping for you is that you can identify maybe 2 or 3 things from this list that make sense to you, that you would like to do, and then start doing them, right? Start doing them as soon as you stop listening to this episode. So please don't feel like journaling is something you have to do. If you hate the idea of journaling, guess what? Don't do it. Do speak more kindly to yourself. That one is important. Another way to connect with yourself, meditation. This is one where I think we all feel like we should meditate. Even I feel like I should meditate more than I do. But there are guided meditations. There's some in particular by a woman named Jess Heslop, and we'll link to her in the show notes. She has some fantastic meditations. My favorite is a 10-minute manifestation meditation that I sometimes do when I'm falling asleep. I've done it with my daughter while falling asleep. And it basically takes you through a 10-minute visualization exercise where you think of a goal, you imagine yourself having achieved the goal, and it's really lovely. There are Meet Your Future Self meditations. There's How to Channel Abundance meditations. I mean, there's all sorts of meditations that are available for free on YouTube and in lots of different apps that I've never looked into myself. But the idea here is, if that's going to be helpful for you, maybe find a way to meditate. I've got clients who talk about how meditation is so powerful and so effective for them in helping them set themselves up for their days. For myself, when I meditate, I usually do it at night, but for you, it might be first thing in the morning. If it helps you and you enjoy it, then that might be part of your way of connecting with yourself. So going back to mental health, we are creating predictability by scheduling and having a plan for our days and ideally for at least the next few years of your life. We're talking about connecting with yourself, the way that you speak to yourself, journaling, and perhaps meditating. Then we have connecting, right? Connecting with others. And here is where I would invite you to lean into your community to help support you. We are wired as humans to have a desire to connect with other humans. And for some of us who feel like we are extroverts, we absolutely need that time with other humans in order to energize ourselves. I say ourselves as though I am an extrovert. I am exactly halfway between an extrovert and an introvert. So for many of you, if you're an extrovert, you're going to want to make sure that you've got that time with others because that's going to help you recharge. My husband is an extrovert, and so he always wants to be around people. I love people, but I don't always want to be around people. I need my time to myself. So if you are an introvert where you find you need a lot of time to yourself, then you need to give yourself that time. And you might also think about ways in which you can connect with other people in a way that is sustainable, a way that gives you energy, a way that preserves the integrity of your relationship with yourself, where you're giving yourself the downtime that you need. So the idea here is you want to be connecting with others. That can be your friends, that can be your family. Find ways to make it doable. So for me, I find it really hard to meet up with people in person. Just the way my life is set up right now, it is the exception and not the rule. Every once in a while, I'll schedule a lunch date with somebody, and it's always hard for me to get there. I always grumble to myself, Paula, why did you go and do this? And I'm always so grateful that I did it, but it's not something I can do as much as I would like to do. And so for me, connection means talking on the phone with my mom, I have a very close friend who you've met on the podcast, Bilen Ulmohomsi, the professional organizer. She has been on a couple of times. So we talk on the phone. Her dog walking schedule matches my kid walking schedule. So we often have compatible windows, even though we're in different time zones. So you might find people in your world who you can easily connect with. If it's somebody at work that you can have lunch with, great. You can see them in person. If you're working remotely, that's not as doable. Maybe there's someone in your neighborhood or you can speak to them by phone. But the idea here is what works for you for connection. Then I would also invite you to think about what supports you want to have in place. So this is where you might look to professionals. You can look to coaches, people like me who are trained to help you to figure out what you want with your life, figure out what you want in your practice, how to overcome problems, how to set goals and then go and achieve them. That might be something that helps you in terms of your support. If the challenges that you have are in the realm of mental health difficulties like depression or anxiety or substance abuse, then you want to find someone to help you, a counselor, a therapist, a group support program. So give yourself access to the people who can help you, the resources, the coaches, the counselors, the people who are trained to help you and who want to help you, people who do these types of jobs. Certainly, I speak for myself. They want to help you. It is something that we are driven to do. And so if you need help, by all means, please, 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 please reach out. There are also communities and group programs that can be really helpful for learning and for support. My husband and I did a group coaching parenting course earlier in this calendar year. it was on Zoom and there were, I don't know, maybe 20 other parents. And it was really interesting to have that experience of learning some really effective strategies for parenting. And then also being able to connect with other parents, many of whom had children who are older than ours. So you have that sense of community, you have that sense of learning. It's really great for your mental health, right? Because you are then feeling connected. You're not feeling alone. You're not feeling like you're the only one, and you have support. I find also in my professional work, I love taking classes. So right now I'm taking an ADHD coaching course. I have my second to last class today, and it puts me in community with other coaches who are interested in the same topic. I'm learning skills that make me more effective at my job. So for you, there might be skills training courses that you can take that will put you in community with other lawyers who are interested in the same things, and that can feel really good. And then I would also encourage you to consume materials that boost your mental health as opposed to deplete your mental health. So by that, I like to think of books that are uplifting. I personally love books about anything self-development, basically related. So time management, boundaries, goal setting, pursuing your dreams. I love books that talk about thoughts and how we perceive our realities. Right now, I'm listening to Dale Carnegie's How to Stop Worrying and Start Living audiobook. It's in my car. I love it. So think about things that you can consume. Podcasts are great. TED Talks are great. Find a medium that works for you. So I love to read. I find that to be really, really relaxing. But at this point in my life, I don't have the luxury of time to sit and read books as much as I would like. I'm using my waking hours to most of the time be on the go. So I do consume some books by audiobook, that, How to Stop Worrying and Start Living being one of them. I listen to it in the car. I sometimes listen to books while I'm walking. I listen to a lot of podcasts because it's really doable for me. I like to pair some tasks that maybe are a little bit dull, like doing the dishes or folding laundry, and I'll listen to something that I find engaging and interesting. So for you, I'd invite you to think about what sources are going to provide you with uplifting materials. So hopefully this podcast that you're listening to right now fits into that category of things that you find energizing, that you find enjoyable, that enhance your life and make you feel better. So the last thing that I wanted to touch on here in terms of mental health self-care is your values, right? And knowing what's most important to you and adhering to those values, right? When you know that family is really important to you, then you put family at a high priority. For me, my absolute top value is health. It is my health, because I know that when I feel healthy, I just enjoy my life more. It's a selfish reason, but that's okay. That's first and foremost. I enjoy my life more, and I'm also better at the things I do. I'm able to serve my family better. I'm able to serve my clients better. I'm able to access greater creativity. I enjoy different parts of life. I can entertain. I can cook meals for my family, my friends, etc. So think about what your values are and then have those values clear to you. It's going to help you in moving forward. Now, I talked about, and I'm realizing that timing wise, I am really taking up a lot of time here. And so I'm going to have to go through the next couple of sections a little bit more quickly. So in terms of the third category of self-care, that's really like bonus self-care. So those are things that I don't rely on in the day-to-day. Everything I've talked about so far is pretty much integrated. These are things that may be exceptional. So travel would be exceptional. Having a day of nothing scheduled. Reading right now for me would be exceptional. I love it, but I'd have to carve it in. It would be kind of a non-habit, if you will. Going to concerts, going to dinner with friends. Maybe it is a day at the spa or a pedicure. Maybe it's going on a hiking or a biking trip. So incorporating those things, they are self-care, but they don't have to be your day-to-day self-care. So think about what you like. And then the other bonus self-care is lowering your expectations, right? I think sometimes we take on things and we want to do them perfectly. We want our house to be tidy. We want to cook the best meals. And so self-care can also be just not doing that. Self-care to me is getting the kids takeout once a week because I don't feel like cooking. It is having a messy house. A lot of the time it's messier than I would like, but I don't want to spend the time cleaning it. And so I don't. Sometimes it means letting somebody else do it. So maybe somebody else is going to host a play date. I am always so grateful when my children's friends have play dates. I think it's great. It means maybe letting somebody else make the meal. It also means saying no sometimes. So those are the 3 categories. And forgive me for going on for so long, and thank you for staying with me. But those are some ideas for self-care in the physical realm, the mental health realm, and finally the, bonus. It's not something in your day-to-day, but you can incorporate it once in a while. So how do you make this stick? Well, I think this has been a theme throughout. You need to do what works for you. You need to plan for activities that integrate into the life that you have, not the life that you wish that you had. Start small and allow yourself to adapt over time. I invite you to plan for these and make it a habit. So it might be really difficult at first, but once you start making it a routine, that will feel more natural to you. And eventually you'll be able to click in to reliance on routines. So I mentioned for me, exercise is now a default. For you, you might think about the habits you've already adopted where you just click into that routine. So think about how you're going to routinize your self-care, whether it's your movement, whether it's the way you take care of nutrition, whether it's some other practice. And when it comes to routines, don't try to force a habit that you don't enjoy. So if you really, really hate going to the gym, or if you love the gym and you really hate running, don't force yourself to do something that you're not going to like. And then I would encourage you to find the pleasure in simple things, right? So as I mentioned, if you're folding laundry, listen to a podcast or some music. Maybe you talk to a friend while you're cooking dinner. Find ways to build enjoyment into your life. Again, the life that you have. And then thirdly, so we've talked about the different types of self-care. We've talked about ways to make it stick. And then finally, accept that your practice is going to ebb and flow, right? There are going to be times where you get completely thrown off track. And that could be because of something that happens at work. It could be because your kids, like mine, have lots of school holidays. And so that can be wonderful. You get to spend more time with your kids. It might also wreak havoc on your self-care routines. It might be that someone gets sick. Maybe you get sick. Maybe a family member gets sick. It could also be that you just get bored, right? Your routine is no longer all that interesting to you. And so you start to slip and you find yourself, off the wagon or however you want to describe it. And the goal here is to just accept that that's going to happen. It happens to me. I feel like right now I am getting back into my sort of optimum routines for self-care, which is possibly why I thought to speak about it today. So what for you does that look like? How are you going to get back on? And the best way that I know of to get back on track is simply to make a conscious choice to do it. And then again, rebuild your practices in a way that is doable. You may not be able to do it all at once, right? It might be that you have to kind of think about what are the things you want to bring in and then do it one at a time. But the idea is just to simply get yourself back into your routine. So when you make self-care simple, right? I've offered lots of ideas on what self-care can look like. And so for you, what are those suggestions or things I haven't even mentioned that you know are great for you, that you like, that are simple? So you want to keep it simple. You want to make it a routine, and you want to know that your routine is going to ebb and flow, and that is okay. So when you make it simple, then you can stick to it and you will feel so much better. And when you have those routines and you're feeling better, you're going to want to maintain it. That motivation is going to come from within, and you'll see how much more effective you are when you look after yourself. So again, if you have concerns about it being selfish or, you should feel guilty about it, when you start to see the benefits, not just to yourself, but to others, if you need that justification, hopefully you don't need that justification, but if you do, then you can always rationalize that you show up better for others when you take care of yourself. Again, it goes back to that whole put your oxygen mask on first so that you can help others. It's key. What will you need in terms of skills in order to create and maintain an effective self-care plan for yourself? Number one, you will need to get to know yourself better, right? You need to know your likes and your dislikes, because what works for one person may not work for you, and vice versa. It will take a little bit of planning. So I've given you some ideas, and you might think about how you will plan in your life what self-care will be a best practice for you. So Do you want to have exercise in the morning or in the afternoon? How do you want to go about your meal planning? What are some habits that make you feel really good? What do you like to read? Who in your life is a person that gives you energy? Who are maybe some energy drainers that you want to avoid? Think about it in your own context and make it work for you. And when it comes to routines or these self-care routines, I think the hardest things are going to be putting yourself first, right? We're going to have that instinct to look after everybody else first. We're going to have that instinct to put work first. Sometimes you are going to need to put yourself first, and that can be hard. If you are new to this or you've really let your self-care practices drift, it could be really hard to get started or to restart. So you can anticipate that, and that's okay. It's allowed to be hard. And it can also be really hard to let other people pick up the slack, right? If you've got other people who are helping you out, it can be hard to feel like, oh, maybe you should be doing that. So you can anticipate those are some of the challenges and the skills that you're going to need in order to implement your self-care. And when you do all of this, of course, you'll feel better. You'll have better energy. You'll feel less resentful. You'll feel less frustrated. You'll be able to avoid burning out. Your practice will feel more sustainable, right? You'll feel more in control. You'll feel more energized. You may find that your performance is really enhanced. And you'll be able to show up in service, right? You'll show up better when you are showing up in service. And we all serve at work, we serve at home, we serve with our friends, and you'll be able to do that in such a more effective way because you will be starting with yourself being cared for. And so that's what I have to share with you today. Again, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or if you want some help. If you're looking for somebody to help support you in your practice and helping you develop your own self-care practices, if you want to be more intentional about your life and your career, you know where to find me, and I am here to serve. I'm here for you. And again, as we wrap up, I would invite you to think about maybe 2 or 3 takeaways that resonate with you, what you can apply. And the one that comes to mind for me that I'm really hopeful that you will all take from today's episode is number 1, self-care is not selfish. You have permission to go ahead and do it. And second of all, that dialogue with yourself, right? If you are someone who currently has a difficult internal dialogue, then please, please, please start practicing a more friendly, a kinder, a more loving way of speaking with yourself. It will make such a difference. So with that, my dear friend, thank you for being with me here this week. I have just loved this time together, and I so much look forward to our next time to connect. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.